and being part of the Chiapas Support Committee, where we decidedly support mass political projects of building a new world that's decolonized, that's depatriarchalized. It's one, denouncing U.S. imperialism, which played a decided role in this coup, and it's also being very clear that the answers are being charted forth by the people in Bolivia, who are, demanding that they have a diverse and ample and robust participatory democracy.
So hey, what's up? My name is Nicholas Ayala. I'm a co-editor at ANTICONQUISTA. We are an anti-imperialist media collective producing content for the Latin American diaspora. Today we're joined by Pambana an internationalist organizer and writer who works on reparations campaigns in the Caribbean, participates in the Black Power movement in the US, is currently working on the movement to free political prisoner Elena Flores. Also with us is Anayansi, who is an educator. They are both core members of the Chiapas Support Committee, a transnational collective that since 1995 has accompanied the Zapatistas and movements for Black and Indigenous autonomy across the Americas, including in Haiti, Honduras, Guatemala, and in another vein, Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia. They are both good friends of mine. Today, we're going to talk about the indigenous and African resistance in Bolivia post-coup and the fight to free the Afro-Bolivian union leader, activist, and organizer, Elena Flores. A quick background on the coup. On October 20th, 2019, there were general elections held in Bolivia, which resulted in the victory of the former president, Evo Morales, and his party, Movimiento al Socialismo, or MAS. Shortly after Evo's victory, the Organization for American States, an imperialist group founded to extend the United States policy of the Monroe Doctrine, declared the October elections fraudulent and manipulated. After days of right-wing protests, Evo pledged to hold new elections, but this was not enough for the right wing, and the military demanded Evo resign. On November 10th, Evo resigned, and conservative leader Janine Áñez assumed the position of interim president without holding any elections. Since then, Janine continues to rule while repressing MAS's political leaders and organizers, as well as journalists. Janine and the coup forces are also to blame for the massacres and killings that occurred post-coup, including in El Alto, where 8 indigenous Bolivians were murdered. So today, our two guests have been to Bolivia, have experienced Bolivia both pre-coup and post-coup, and have worked on activism campaigns to help free political prisoners and journalists like Elena Flores. So to start off, tell us what you experienced before the coup that ousted President Morales. What were the conditions like? What were the people, how were the people feeling? What was the sentiment in the air? Just general feelings or general ideas of what Bolivia was like under Evo.
I can start very quickly. So both Pambana and I had the immense privilege of being in Bolivia pre-coup, and the sentiment surely was a little bit of, not anxiety per se, but it was very much clear that people had in their minds that the elections were coming up, right? And it had been clear, and this is across Latin America and the Caribbean or anywhere in the world where people hold the power, there's always someone trying to take it back, right? So people were organizing themselves, and there was constant mobilizations and constant organizing, and not solely around the elections as well, but people still having the ability to protest and have their voices heard. So for example, we got to witness and participate in a mass campaign against violence against women that was sponsored and promoted by the government as well and uplifted by the people, and you wouldn't be able to see that today, right? So people right now are fighting to continue to live, and pre-coup people were able to voice their opinions freely as well.
Pambana, you want to add anything?
Yeah, so as Sis Anayansi mentioned, we had the honor and privilege to be there. It was in August. exchanging with folks from the social movements, the Bartolina Cisas, who are peasant, original peoples, working women who are confederated and remember their ancestor who waged an incredible battle against Spanish colonization in the late 1700s and almost, overthrew them. What we witnessed was just incredible level of political consciousness, a level of organization, as Anayansi shared, that was, tens of thousands of people incredibly mobilized and clear that they're protecting their proceso de cambio. And we had the opportunity to share with organizers who told us about, what the 14 years of the Movimiento Socialismo has meant. It came to power from the people as a political instrument of campesinos, of workers, of housewives, of miners, just a mass gathering and unification of both peasants, factory workers, miners, etc., to build a new Bolivia. And so what people were benefiting from is the fruit of their labor that includes a new constitution that was written through a constituent assembly, a popular process that we all long for as Black and Indigenous and colonized peoples across the globe. Laws that are written by us that are, agreements about how we want our societies to be organized, how we want resources to be shared. And in that constitution and in the achievements of the people, there's massive land reform and agrarian reform for which women were often the beneficiaries. I think 45% of new titles went to women, where the state of Bolivia is recognized as a plurinational state of 36, both indigenous and Black nations. Where there was just incredible change when it comes to the universalization of healthcare. We were in the rural areas where we saw clinics, where we saw community centers. This was, before this, it was the neoliberal age. And before that, a series of dictatorships and colonization that was just a mass disinvestment and theft from the majorities who are indigenous and Black Bolivians. And so what they've achieved is just tremendous in terms of, erasing I'm not sure the exact statistics, but extreme poverty decreased tremendously. Women no longer dying in childbirth, women in Cuba no longer dying in childbirth, people learning how to read and write, Cuban doctors and medical professionals in the rural areas restoring vision. Just incredible achievements and a really exciting fruit of popular resistance.
Mm-hmm. And under, while Evo was president, would you also say there was like a political shift as well, like going from, being a puppet of the U.S. empire to being more international, creating, relations with nations like Venezuela, nations like Cuba, nations who were always sanctioned and blockaded by the U.S. There was a political shift under Evo, which I think is also really important, which is also, based on what the people wanted and what benefited the people the most. And unfortunately, after the coup, a lot of that work, what would you say, was it undone or was it, being repressed and how so? If you just want to give a little details about, like, I don't know, you were you there during the coup or briefly after it?
So the coup, as you said, on the 10th of November was a total affront to the people's demands. So elections at the end of October, and Mas, the Movimiento Socialismo, won the majority of votes, something like 47% of the votes.
Right.
And the military police, local elite, multinational interests, with a big assist from the OAS, which lied outright about elections having been fraudulent, which they were not, proven by multiple studies. The coup was incredibly violent. I mean, it immediately showed its character to be what you described, racist, misogynist, anti-labor, against the rural peoples. They committed 3 massacres in Sacaba, in Sencata, in Julio, and showed themselves to be explicitly against the people, against humanity. And as you mentioned, began to make ties with all kinds of really vile figures across the globe. So recognizing Juan Guaido as, you know, this títere in Venezuela, who's not just a puppet, but is an actual fascist white supremacist who supports, you know, the massacring of Black Venezuelans. You know, really horrific characters. And then also locally, in the case of Elena Flores, whom we'll speak more about, the Afro-Bolivian union leader of the Cocaleros y Milungas, Janine Áñez almost immediately freed one of Elena Flores' enemies, Franklin Gutierrez, who's the previous head of the union, whose, you know, tenure ended in 2017. He refused to hold elections and has ties to all these paramilitaries. So absolutely, the politics of the state and also the conditions in which people were living changed tremendously on the 10th of November. From a state that was returning the resources, subsoil resources, as well as health and education, people, the majority of the people, to one where there's all kinds of corruption scandals around ventilators, the privatization of lands, the selling off of state resources, and politics of supporting right-wing regimes. You know, Bolsonaro looks very kindly on Janine Áñez. Trump almost immediately recognized her. So on every single level, you see just a terrible right-wing attack, but of course always resistance of the people immediately after the coup. Tens of thousands of people marching in the streets, which Anayansi can speak more about. But I was in Bolivia with some Caribbean comrades and another compañera from the Chiapas Support Committee in March and June. This was under the conditions of the coup regime and a militarized quarantine without any kind of public health support.
Right. And so one of the things you mentioned is the cracking down of mass figures, political figures, workers, women, journalists, one of those being Elena Flores. So if either of you could just give us a little background on who Elena Flores is, why she's important to the movement. As I already said, she's a union leader, activist in Afro-Bolivian. I guess we want to learn more about why she was arrested. Why do you think she was specific? Why specifically her? Why was she targeted by this regime?
Sure, I'll start. Anayansi speaks beautifully on just the tremendous centrality of peasant campesino women in the movement and total transformation of Bolivia. But Elena Flores, according to her family, who submitted a petition to the United Nations denouncing her political imprisonment, you know, has been said very clearly that she has been politically imprisoned by the coup regime because of her importance as an Afro-Bolivian woman leader, the leader of a union of 35,000 cocaleros. You know, for many of us, we dream of having union membership in those numbers, our bases in those numbers, and you know, that it's just really tremendous. And she was elected as president, the first Afro-Bolivian woman elected president on the 31st of July of last year. And this was after the previous administration refused to hold elections, was building with paramilitaries and illicit trade networks, and you know, was responsible for the deaths and threatening of many people while enriching themselves with union dues. I mean, just kind of quintessential right wing, tied with the coup supporters. who made themselves known very early on. Many folks with whom we spoke in Bolivia made clear that although it was horrific, they were not surprised in completely by the fact that the coup was waged in such a racist and misogynist way. So Elena Flores, according to her family and her union, is a leader who is looking to totally transform the narco politics of the region, for which the U.S. is a major player. We look at Colombia, which has just been ravaged by these huge elites benefiting from illicit trade networks and, a total terror against campesinos. So she was at the front of promoting alternative livelihoods, of building and consolidating campesino power, and of being the heart of the Afro-Bolivian world, descendants of enslaved Africans who played a role in both anti-colonial as well as anti-neoliberal regimes. And she's just a tremendous organizer and has been in the union since she was a youth, and ran on a platform of unity of the Yungas, where most Afro-Bolivians live, ran on a platform of ousting these violent actors from the region, and of really ensuring livelihood and dignity and land for the workers, the farmers who farm the sacred coca leaf. And so she was targeted for all of those reasons, and she was incarcerated on the 4th of March under the coup regime, under totally trumped up charges. They claim that she trespassed on a hospital, which is owned by the union of which she was elected president. She's been detained during a global pandemic in which the rates of death of people imprisoned are just absolutely genocidal and alarming.
And this is after they've gotten rid of Cuban doctors, without they've slowly rolled back any sort of healthcare reform or welfare. So you can imagine that she's in a very precarious situation, especially given the fact that she's in a prison right now. So what you mentioned that she was a major figure in the peasant movements and the campesino movements in Bolivia. How important are the campesino movements in Bolivia?
I can take this one, and then Pambana, I'm sure, will add beautiful details. But the campesino movements are what made the last 14 years possible, quite literally. So, I mean, I don't want to take it too far back, right? But Bartolina Sisa and Tupac Katari themselves, could be considered campesinos. And they destroyed the colonial leaders, I mean, that's what they were fighting for. And they were killed, but it's that legacy that has lived on in the Bolivian people. There were the Agrarian Reforms in the 40s or 50s that then led on to what we see today. So consistently massive mobilizations from the campesino leaders, and they are the ones that pushed everyone to power, right? So they are the ones that participated in the creation of the constitution that Pambana was mentioning. So they're consistently mobilizing, and they're the heart of Bolivia, to put it simply.
You could say that there's an indigenous and Black root in the campesino movement in Bolivia and really all over the world. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the case across the Americas, the Ayala, that so often the heart of mass movement and the process of decolonization is led by the people who work the land. And as Anayansi was saying, oftentimes organizers would tell us about their ancestors who, like Bartolina Sisa and Tupac Katari, were, in their case, coca leaf traders who walked, I mean, the heights of these mountains and the depths of these valleys is incredible, just walking the land, learning the land, and being very clear that the colonial system is one of really wretched subjugation and incredible violence, and then another world is really possible, as the Zapatistas say, and necessary. And particularly now, I mean, the Bartolina Cisas, the Confederation in Bolivia currently is one of the most vocal organizations, across the plurinational state of Bolivia, and a central member in a pact of unity who have been denouncing the coup, and who also before that were central in the neoliberal years and the mass mobilizations to kick out Boni and Mesa, who's now pretending to be a good person, but is responsible for horrible acts of violence. And the Campesinos are also, in the majority. They're the majority of people.
Right.
And as Anayansi was saying, the Constitution, the laws of the land are ones that recognize, even Pachamama, if I'm not mistaken, is recognized as having constitutional rights. That's the fruit of people who work the land. People talk to us about how they planted in these high mountains according to the sun and the moon and cycles. So there's a deep cosmovision that's respect for the earth and respect for humanity that's central to this.
Right, and the learning about the colonial history and the indigenous and African history seems even more important now, especially with the coup in power. It seems like that fight needs to be revisited, revaunched. So it's good that we have that history as a background, as something that we could use for the future struggles as well. Now, I know that you're working on there's a UN campaign to free Elena Flores. You want to just speak more about like the campaign, what the goal is, or what has been done so far to raise awareness and international solidarity? Because I think it's interesting, especially now, to look at campaigns of international solidarity, particularly among African and indigenous campesinos or workers, especially with such a global imperialist and capitalist system. These international struggles can, overcome the international order, which seeks to destroy all people who are workers or peasants throughout the whole world. And so I think building internationalism is really important, really cool. So you want to speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I will speak just on the details of the campaign and pass it on to talk about just the critical nature of internationalism and Black and Indigenous autonomy to my compañera. But in particular, so there has been quite, not enough, but there has been international support for the Bolivian people who are fighting for their proceso de cambio, which, under any kind of metric that is decent and dignified, is a process that's incredible, and worthy of defense. And, that's why it was attacked and continues to be. So at the coup, a number of people in the hundreds signed letters denouncing the coup having taken place and naming it a coup, which unfortunately continues to be necessary because right-wing media and even some confused progressive media outlets have not been definitive enough about the fact that a democratically elected president was ousted, and worse, that a great number of organizers were forced into hiding, that massacres were carried out against indigenous peoples protesting, that the political persecution of journalists, including their being tortured and disappeared, is just, it was a coup. And the OAS really worked very hard to make it seem that it was not a coup, and particularly Bolivian social movements who are in the tens of thousands, despite being fired upon, made that really clear. from the Caribbean. The CARICOM heads of state joined Latin American nations in the OAS on the 18th of December, putting out a resolution against the racist violence of Janine Áñez, and that was in the OAS. And you know, there has been some international denouncing on the nation-state level, and particularly from grassroots organizations who recognize that the future of Bolivia's process is also, you know, our future of transforming a capitalist racist state into one that actually is for the people. Also, particularly when it comes to Elena Flores, after her detention, 35 organizations and 180 signatories, mostly Black, Caribbean, Indigenous student workers, signed on for her immediate release. That letter was published pretty widely, and I believe first with Alpha TV and Telesur, and a number of organizations and people signed on calling for immediate release. And then also, since then, as you mentioned, her family has submitted a petition to the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, which is housed in the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights. So of course, the UN, not always perfect for all of its need for incredible reform and a long history of having occupied and carried out immense violence against Black people. I'm thinking Haiti, I'm thinking Chad, I'm thinking the Democratic Republic of Congo, and many other instances. But it is a place that is being called on to mobilize resources to defend Black lives, and in this case, Elena Flores' life. And so her family submitted this petition calling for the coup regime to be held accountable. And UN entities have actually denounced the coup regime, writing letters, which is a formal complaint process for massacres, and having called them that for the death of an Argentinian journalist, Sebastián Moro, and a number of other cases. The Inter-American Court or Commission of Human Rights, which is housed in the OAS, also has denounced the violence. And yeah, the hope, I mean, yesterday we heard news that the elections have been postponed by the Electoral Board, which was appointed by Áñez. And so hopefully there will be a renewed outcry against what is an affront to the people's demands, and in particular, and also Mas assembly members. So somehow they've managed to keep the majority in the legislature, which is a tremendous achievement. And they created a commission calling for the freedom of particularly women political prisoners. So Elena Flores is one, and also Maria Choque Quispe, who is the head of the Electoral Supreme Board and has been incarcerated, a tremendous indigenous leader. And Patricia Hermosa, who's also an indigenous woman, who is Evo's attorney, who is incarcerated, all of them on trumped up charges, and among many other political prisoners. So there's, you know, multiple ways, a lot of organizing. And, you know, the request for folks is to learn about these cases and to send out letters. And, you know, I'm sure we can do a call to action, but.
Right. Well, getting the information out there is the first struggle. Educating is the first, you know, oftentimes the first fight. But one thing you mentioned that we could talk about is I'm going to mention was they recently postponed the elections, which is, you know, I think, what is it, the third time they've done this now? So that's, you know, that's big news, and the fact that it just further proves that the so-called elections which the coup regime said that they were going to have, you know, shortly after the coup, was never going to happen in reality. And it was pretty obvious that they were never going to hold elections, because in almost every polling for each election, the coup regime was being beaten by Mas over and over again. So, you know, what do y'all think is the future of Bolivia with the postponement of these elections? Do you see mobilizations coming about from Mas, from indigenous, from workers, from campesinos? Will there be more repression? Will there be more struggle? What are your thoughts about that?
Before that, I wanted to quickly get to your point about internationalism that you had posed previously. So, I mean, what Pambana was already mentioning, you know, the situation of Elena Flores is one with a lot of seriousness, and just all of Bolivia's situation right now is of course very important. And as Anticonquista, you know, as people, as diaspora from Latin America and the Caribbean, we sort of have a responsibility to, you know, be a voice as well, or elevating these voices and demanding justice for these communities. And to the question that you just posed right now, I mean, it was sort of expected that these elections were going to be continued to be postponed. Folks who have been in the struggle a lot longer than us, and this is what gives me a little bit of solace, is the fact that this continuously happens, you know, and we just have to keep responding to it. And the Bolivian people, the indigenous and Black masses, are going to continue responding to it by being out in the streets. If you go on Telesur, you can see videos that are clipped from Twitter of people in the plazas demanding the liberation of the women who are political prisoners. You know, so the repression, I believe, is going to continue. It's already being done through the lack of public health during a global pandemic. And the postponing of the elections is only going to worsen the situation on that front. And the violence is just, I mean, the hyper-militarization of during quarantining, I think is probably just gonna worsen, you know, like immediately after the coup, the military was everywhere and truly just ravaging violence against these people. And the people are not gonna back down. I mean, it's been months, it's soon going to be a year since the coup last year, and people are still out in the streets demanding justice, and specifically for someone like Elena Flores as well. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And people have, you know, the candidates for president and vice president, Luis Arce and David Choquehuanca, have repeatedly in many different polls, including some that are pretty right, been coming ahead. You know, it's really clear that despite just the absolute horrors of violence of the Jimmy Áñez regime, you know, immense amounts of resources being given to the military, including a special decree that granted them impunity for massacres. You know, we just, despite all of that, the destruction of community radios, which were in the tens across all of the countryside, despite the ouster of Cuban medical professionals, the refusal to support Cuban support, despite the lack of subsidies during the global pandemic, the dismantling of the universalized healthcare system, despite all of that, people continue to voice themselves. You know, Anayansi mentioned they're in the plaza demanding Elena Flores and all political prisoners' freedom. People were in the streets despite being fired upon, and people continue to say that the Movimiento Socialismo is the political instrument that they support. And the international community has the obligation to call for elections that are free, that are transparent, that are free of violence, and that ensure the public health and well-being, which is possible. You know, the reason that they give that it's because of COVID is just a total farce, according to organizers on the ground. Elections have been held in other countries, in St. Kitts and Nevis, in the Dominican Republic, and it is possible for Bolivia to hold elections, particularly since this coup regime has been so disastrous and fatal for the people. So you know, people are really well organized and people are awake. And so they will defend their process, and our responsibility is to call for the end of U.S. support that's both military and financial, of both regime change as well as massacring of people.
Right. And, you know, one of the things I think is important about when we see a coup like this is it heightens the importance of ensuring that future coups in nations like Venezuela or in Cuba don't happen, because we see what the effects would be, what the results would be. You know, it would be these massacres, it would be this political repression of workers and campesinos and union leaders. it would be an attack against women, attack against Black and Indigenous peoples. And so it just makes it that much more important to ensure that these fights and these struggles in other nations continue. So thank you so much for being here and being willing to do the interview and talking about your experiences. Is there anything else either of you want to add?
Well, I'll just add, doing reparations work and being part of Black Power movements, and being part of the Chiapas Support Committee, where we decidedly support mass political projects of building a new world that's decolonized, that's depatriarchalized. It's one, denouncing U.S. imperialism, which played a decided role in this coup, and it's also being very clear that the answers are being charted forth by the people in Bolivia, who are demanding that they have a diverse and ample and robust participatory democracy, that they write their constitution, that they return the land and the resources to the people who work it, to the majorities. And these are all processes that we deeply need. They are our ruined processes, those who have escaped from the plantation and continue to support us in trying to dismantle and destroy the plantation. They are specifically Black and Indigenous from a cosmovision and worldview that respects mutual reciprocity and dignity. And, we must all move to act because, as you said, Cuba has witnessed a blockade for all of these decades. Venezuela is witnessing just immense violations of every single international law and principle of national sovereignty for daring to be a majority Black and Indigenous country that's charting a path that's distinct, that's using resources for people's well-being. So, forward ever with these processes, and they're deeply, deeply connected to all of our local struggles to cancel rent, to abolish police, to defend Black lives, to abolish ICE, to end militarized borders, and all of the above.
Just to finalize what Pambana said beautifully, down with U.S. imperialism, down with imperialism overall, down with capitalism, and forward with the people's movements and the people's world.